Hello, we are talking about where, how, and why of migration today. And you should take a second to set up your notes with these key concepts and questions. By the time you finish this video, you should be able to identify types of movement and migration, explain how push and pull factors impact migration, and differentiate between forced and voluntary migration, and be able to provide examples of each. So let's get started. The first thing we're going to talk about is types of movement and migration. So the first thing that you need to know that migration is movement, right? When we talk about migration, it's talking about movement. However, I've broken it down into types of movement and types of migration for you to help you kind of keep some of these terms straight. Okay, so there are three types of movement. The first one is called cyclic, or sometimes it's called circulation. This is really short-term, repetitive movement that occurs on a daily or weekly basis. So oftentimes, this is part of a person's activity space, right? The places where they travel most often. So think about things like going to work, going to school, shopping, things where you are returning home after a very short time period. The second type of movement is periodic. This is when we see longer periods away from home. It's usually at least one season, but it is still not permanent. The move isn't permanent. So an example of this is called transhumance. This is seasonal movement of livestock workers because they move their herds to different pastures depending on what season it is. So that word transhumance you will see again. So make sure you know that that's a periodic movement. Other examples of periodic movement is things like migrant laborers. So oftentimes migrant laborers will move from farm to farm across the United States because certain crops are harvested at different times of the year. So each season they're in a new place. Another example is military service. If someone is called to maybe, let's say, go to Afghanistan to serve in the military for a year and a half. Other examples are college students. Remember or think about how college students go off to college in the fall. They come home for breaks, usually they come home for summer. And then lastly, luxury vacation travelers, right? So these are the people that have the ability to move to warm areas in the winter and cooler areas in the summer. Lastly is migratory movement, right, which seems redundant. However, the big difference here is that migration means long-term movement, right? So people are making moves in which they change their permanent settlement. So that would be like if I decided to move to France. That would be an example of migratory movement because I am going to stay there until the foreseeable future, right? So I just want to hit on the terminology here before we move forward. Remember, immigrants are people who are moving into a country, right? They're going into a place. And sometimes this is called in-migration, just to keep things simple for you and I. But I also want you to be familiar that you know that in-migration means that an immigrant is coming in to a country, right? So I've circled this I. I means in to me. Whereas emigrants, which is really hard to hear verbally or vocally, the difference in that, but an emigrant is someone who is leaving a country, who is moving out, right? So sometimes that's called out migration. And before we move on, I just need you to know a simple equation here. Net migration. This is the difference between immigration and emigration in a specific country. Okay, so think about it. If the number of immigrants is higher than the number of emigrants, that's going to be a positive net migration. Okay, and vice versa. If the number of emigrants is higher than the number of immigrants, then that's going to be a negative net migration. Okay, so now let's change over into types of migration. It is very important to pay attention to the words that are on the screen. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is international migration, right? We're going to think about migration in terms of the amount of distance that people are traveling. And internationally is a permanent movement from one country to another. It's actually very simple. But if I were you, I would identify here this TER like I have. You'll see why. And so international migration patterns indicate that a lot of the migration flows are from developing countries to developed countries. So you can see here the US has a huge immigration rate, as well as places like Germany, France, Spain, the UK, Italy, but we don't see a lot of it here in Africa or South America. And most of that migration happening in these Asian countries is happening in Southwest Asia, where all those oil-producing countries are. So the highest in-migration rates are actually in Southwest Asia, because remember, those poor migrants from Asian countries move into Southwest Asia to do that dangerous oil work. And then the biggest immigration flow from one single country to another is Mexico. So on this map, this is the world-wide immigrants. And so you can see Mexico is the largest country on this map, indicating that there is the most movement from Mexico to other countries. But you can also see that Russia and India, Pakistan, Afghanistan are also pretty large. Okay, so here is where it gets a little confusing. So internal or intra-national migration, okay? So this is kind of like the second type of migration, and then I'm going to talk to you about subsets within that type, okay? So before I do talk to you about that, though, I want to remind you of the concept of distance decay. Remember that the idea of distance decay is that the further away a location is, the less likely people are to interact with that location. And this is the same thing with migration, right? We see much more internal migration, which means movement, permanent movement within a country, than we see international migration. Okay, so remember, internal or intra-national is going to indicate movement within a country itself. Okay, now there are two different kinds of internal migration. The first is inter-regional. Okay, so what this means is this is movement, permanent movement from one region of a country to another. Okay, so you can see here this depicted in the United States, right? We can see that the largest movements that we're seeing are people moving from the Northeast to the South, the Midwest to the South, and the West to the South. And this area right here that's been identified, the South, is also called the Sun Belt. Okay, so we can tell that the most inter-regional migration in the United States is towards the South or the Sun Belt. Another example here is the Rust Belt to the Sun Belt again on another map, but this depicts it in waves, and you can kind of see again that most of this Northeast Midwest area is moving south. Okay, the second subtype of this internal migration is called intra-regional. Okay, and so this is movement within one region of a country. Permanent movement within a region of a country. So whereas when we were looking at the US, we were moving in different regions, here we're moving within one. Okay, so this is typically seen in two types of ways, much more simple to think about. Intra-regional migration is typically rural to urban, meaning moving from somewhere that is primarily farming based to a big urban city, or we've seen in more developed countries a lot of movement from cities to suburbs. So you can see here movement in the United States We see much more migration of people moving from cities to suburbs in both of these age groups than we see them moving from suburbs to cities. Okay, so think about intra-regional as these two very easy types, rural to urban or city to suburb. Here's another way to think about the different types of migration. They're all depicted here on the same map. You can see our international migration is coming from Central America and then to the United States. You can see internal inter-regionals, these red lines, and then you can see this small movement within this one region, the internal intra-regional movement. Okay, why do people migrate voluntarily? Okay, so a voluntary migrant is one that's chosen to move. And what they do is they weigh push and pull factors. And so first, let's talk about what those are. A push factor is a reason, a condition, an event, or a perception that leads people to emigrate or move away from a location, right? It's pushing them out. Most of these push factors are seen as negative. However, that's not true in every single case. Pull factors are reasons people choose and are attracted to a specific destination, okay? So this is kind of like the attraction that's pulling them towards this place. And we're going to kind of look at these through our ESPN framework. And what I suggest that you do is you take a second to set up your notes to look like this graphic organizer here so you can keep everything straight. So let's just talk about, I'm going to go through these really briefly. Economic reasons are the most common reasons why people migrate, and the push factors, okay, things that are pushing people away economically, have to do with high unemployment rates, a lot of job competition, low paying work, and poverty. That seems pretty obvious, right? And then so the pull factors should seem pretty obvious too, right? Things that pull people economically to a place is available jobs, high paying jobs, right? A more developed country or a higher standard of living. And also opportunities to send money home to family. This is called remittances. That's an important term that you need to know. Some social push factors, folks. Racial, religious, ethnic discrimination, right? Nobody likes to live in those conditions. An imbalanced sex ratio could be a social factor because it would make it impossible for a man to find a wife, like we've talked about, like in China or India, or overpopulation, which leads to overcrowding. Whereas some pull factors are things like religious freedom, education, and reuniting with family. Political push factors are things like restrictive or oppressive governments, war, or unsafe places with high crime rates. So on the opposite, those pull factors are going to be things like political stability, democracy, and safety or a low crime rate. And then lastly, natural and environmental push factors, bad things, right? So things like drought or famine, natural disasters like hurricanes, tsunamis, tornadoes, earthquakes, volcanoes, flooding, and then also lack of water and desertification. So you can see here on this map of Africa, the places that are really at risk of desertification, which means that there's no water and agriculture cannot happen there. Some environmental pull factors, though, let's finish this off, are environmentally attractive areas like moving next to a lake, right? Or moving into the mountains or warmer climates. Okay, lastly, we're going to talk about why are people forced to migrate, okay? Involuntary or forced migration is when a migrant has been forced to move, and it involves imposition of authority or power, so there's no choice for the migrant themselves. And so some examples of this are kind of like refugees, right? These are people who are forced to migrate out of their home countries and cannot return. They're due to fear or persecution because of race, ethnicity, religion, politics, something like that. It could also be environmental. This also includes internally displaced people. So these are migrants who move within the same part of a country to avoid those threats that refugees are facing. So an example of forced migration would be like this refugee situation, but also like the Trail of Tears, the Holocaust, or maybe the Atlantic slave trade.